Human trafficking is a very difficult topic to be able to get accurate statistics, because much of it is hidden and it's very hard for some groups gather statistics by looking at prosecutions, some by simply looking at cases coming to the fore. Others look by looking at employment statistics. So we have a range of factors that give us a figure maybe between 21 as the lowest million, 21.9 as the lowest million, up to 36 or 37 million people in human trafficking in the world at the moment, whether you go by the Global Index or the Trafficking in Persons Report or one of the various groups. So I think I changed the order just before Julie. We'll move on. Just to put it into a slightly a perspective that you might be able to get an image and link in with some of the things that in more recent times you may have seen in the media. We'll just look at labour trafficking, which has become an increasing phenomenon in Australia. Maybe it always existed but was not identified. So this is just one example. Some of the elements of human trafficking that are in that video clip I'll speak to in a moment. I'd like to start at the beginning. The congregations in Australia were really inspired by the fact that in 2001, the leaders of religious sisters congregations across the world were at a meeting in Rome, and it was brought to our attention that there was an explosion from 1995 and an increasing number of identification of people who had been trafficked. And there was a decision by religious sisters to take that on across the world and link our work. In Australia, it took us a little bit longer to get a group together to begin that work, but it was at the outset was to address insistently at every level the abuse and sexual exploitation of women and children, with particular attention to the trafficking of women, and it had become a multinational business. In October in 2004, we began the first group for ACRATH. As the work has become more identified, and both at the UISG level, the Union of the International Superiors General, and the various groups around the world, the knowledge of human trafficking has expanded, and the manifestations or the faces of human trafficking. So we haven't limited the work to working with people who may have been trafficked into sexual exploitation. So we have thought there are a couple of founding principles upon which ACRATH works. First of all, thinking about the Declaration of Human Rights. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude, and slavery and servitude will be prohibited in all their forms. That goes back to the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, there are a lot of humanists could be doing this work. We also work from the motivation of what would Jesus do if Jesus was faced with any of this in his time. The gospel inspiration of whatever you do to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you do to me. And the beautiful thing from John 10:10, I have come that all may have life and have it to the full. And any form of human trafficking is really a denigration of the best of human life. So those words inspire our work as Catholic religious who are addressing human trafficking here in Australia. In recent times, we've been so encouraged by the words of Pope Francis. Pope Francis has taken this on as a major initiative to be addressed across the worldwide church. He said some very fine statements that draw our attention to this as being modern day slavery, a crime against humanity, that we have to work from the top to the bottom, from the periphery to the centre and back, from leaders of communities in villages, working with public opinion, and get the key players to address this. And to that end, Pope Francis has set up a working group. It's called the Santa Marta Group, and that is trying to link in the Conference of Bishops and the wider church, as well as the work that was being done by the various groups of religious sisters in each continent. So what is trafficking? Trafficking has an international definition, and it is in the Palermo Protocol. It's a human rights declaration around the meaning of trafficking, and then there is the requirement of a country that signs on to the convention to actually implement law to bring change about. So trafficking is seen to be the action of recruitment, the transport, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons, by means of threat or use or force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, or giving payments or benefits to a person to control them as victims. It can be for a range of reasons, for the purpose of exploitation, which includes sexual exploitation, forced labour, slavery and other similar exploitative practices, and the removal of organs. I find this diagram as it captures what there are three elements in human trafficking. There's the process of recruitment or harbouring or moving people from internally in a country or from one country to another, or obtaining them, paying somebody else to get them. And it's by the means of using force or coercion or fraud. Though a lot of people are caught in the web of trafficking because they have either been coerced or they've been given fraudulent information, and then the end result is that they are not in a work situation that they thought they were going into. They are in an exploitative or a slavery-like work situation. And why is it done? What's the end, the means? The means is, the end is involuntary servitude. People end up in involuntary servitude. They end up with debt bondage. Often there's a promise, a false or a fraudulent promise made that you will receive a great job, you will earn X amount, or you'll earn big money. And when they start in the work, then debt bondage is placed on them and saying, but, you know, I got you from Thailand to here or Korea to here, and you owe me this, and you owe this for your board and for the transport in the country and for the food and whatever. So in the end, the debt goes up and up. So that's debt bondage. And then there also the end is sexual exploitation or having slave labour. So we just go, and Julie might just go through, slip through that. Just trying to bring to your notice that there is no neat figure. This is a very untidy area of work because we can't get very good statistics. So some of them though, and these come from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, this would be the most conservative group because it depends on a notification, an identification of people who've been trafficked, of then an investigation at least. Very few successful prosecutions have been held across the world. Between 2013 and 2014, that was in that 1 year, the UNODC had that 63,000 people as new notifications. So they have identified various routes or trafficking transport routes or hubs from key hubs. The hubs keep changing and the routes keep changing. An unfortunate statistic is that 51% of women, 28% of the detected victims were children, and the majority girls. This has been seen to be a gendered crime, that there has been an extensive amount of human trafficking that has involved women and young girls. As more is known about labour trafficking, we can see that the statistics will probably become a little bit more data on the number of men and boys in human trafficking. An unfortunate statistic is also that there's a large number of women who are part of the trafficking chains, which is quite disturbing. So to bring it back home to Australia, we'll skip the next slide, thanks. I'm not going to use that, thank you. Here in Australia, just in the news, you will have seen that there is human trafficking going on. We have many, many examples of it. And if you've paid attention to the newspaper in the last few weeks, we had this one, blackmail and extortion and slavery is rife. It was Adele Ferguson, you know, the journalist with the ABC, she does, and The Age. She does some very good investigations, but these people were owed $30,000 for the work that they'd been doing, and had been 2.5 years, 2 years and 7 months, and never been paid. Australia's slave trade is hiding in plain sight. She's saying we need to open our eyes because there are manifestations of human trafficking and slavery around our world. Just in April, the focus on brothels and the trafficking of women. There is trafficking of women into legal and illegal brothels. And we, as ACRATH, don't go into those brothels. We do work with our partner organisation, Project Respect, who have qualified social workers who do a lot of outreach there. We often pick up some of these women for support, as I'll go on in a moment. Just at the end of May, stamping slavery is a task for us all. And this article picks up the slavery that is in supply chains. We want the cheapest this, the cheapest that, and the cheaper the goods, the more likely that there's been some exploitation, possibly slavery, and maybe trafficking in the supply chain. But slavery itself comes under the definition of trafficking. Some of our ACRATH members were involved in this case, which was seasonal workers from Vanuatu who had a seasonal workers visas in Queensland, and they had been working for months and had never been paid. Somebody reported that there was some irregularities, and those people were summarily deported with nothing. Right, so there is often not a good identification of people who may have been trafficked. And then there is some, I'll talk about the initiative of the Global Slavery Act. The other area of human trafficking that I'll come to in a moment in a bit more detail is around forced marriage. That's this statistic here, that forced marriage has been growing in Australia, and it's one of the forms of trafficking that's been identified as being on the increase. Again, we're looking at the tip of the iceberg of the cases that we actually have and that we know. So in 2014, 11 cases were reported and then went through and went to the Australian Federal Police, who then followed through with implementing the law. In 2015, it was 33. In last year, there were 69 cases investigated to look at. And in this year so far, I heard from one of the AFP officers that it's in excess of 100 now. So last week there was the prosecution of an imam who was had performed a false marriage. The child was 14 and the man was 34. And last week, or this week, the 22nd of June, that imam received a suspended sentence. Right? It's not much punishment for the sort of work. He has had his marriage licence in the state of Victoria revoked. So that's one plus. So ACRATH has been working on 4 major areas. One is around raising awareness. And fortunately, we have Dave down the back. Dave, I didn't know Dave was coming. Dave has worked, Dave is a Salesian, and we have men and women in ACRATH. We have some brothers and priests who have been connected with us. We've had a program we've called the RAP, Radio and Print Awareness Project. And this has been trying to get into different languages and to different community radio, because we've discovered in our work that many vulnerable populations and people who may be hearing community radio in their own language may be able to identify that this is happening to me. So these are the language groups that we've worked with so far. And Dave was just telling me that he is on to following up some of the other community radio and ethnic radio stations. So that's one project. The second one is we do a lot of education and awareness of work within schools to educate children, particularly senior secondary, but secondary school students. Therese is down the back. Therese Power is a Mercy sister, and Therese has been really involved in a lot of our awareness raising programs. We have developed an education package for senior secondary, really targeted year 10, 11 and 12. And we've run that program several times in cooperation and support from the Catholic Education Office in Melbourne, and we've done it in Adelaide, and we've done it in Parramatta Diocese. So it's a series of lessons that could be a unit of work that could be taught as part of citizenship program, part of religious education and society, because we've put a theological and scriptural base to the work of why this is something that we're addressing. So that's part of our awareness. And then we have a very lively website. Nolene Simmons is a Mara sister from Sydney, and she maintains the website and uploads things virtually every day. There's always things coming up onto the website. So in our objectives, one of the other objectives has been around we did quite a lot of work with Professor Bob Peace from Deakin University, and also with Stephen, and I don't remember his name, he's from ACU. And it was around looking at how do we look at education of men and boys such that they don't act out of an exploitative relationships with women or girls, and that they actually can attend to that whole thing of male privilege in our society. It's one of the drivers of human trafficking and the exploitation. If you watched the 7:30 report on Monday night, you would have been appalled, as I was, and I've seen this firsthand in the Philippines. There is a new investigation being undertaken by the federal police of exploitation of children who are being filmed in being sexually abused, and people in Australia and other places are paying to view it. These people are being doubly exploited and abused. Their their lives, their children. I saw it with my own eyes in 2004, and I was absolutely shocked to the core. So we have actually had some groups that have been helping us to work on stopping the demand, but we can then advocate that it's not just stopping the demand around sexual exploitation, it's stopping the demand about our demand for cheap goods, cheap services of all kinds, right? Because that's what drives some of the other forms of trafficking and exploitation. So our second objective is working with trafficked people. And in the main, a lot of the work we do is being a companion to a trafficked woman and sometimes their children. Trafficked people, we are not a group of social workers, and we are not a group of lawyers. We're largely a group of religious, a few have come out of social work, and a couple of psychologists, which are very helpful, who are very helpful to us. But most of us are educators. So we're being very careful that we're not going into the realm of giving poor visa or legal advice. But these people, women and their children, often need huge amounts of companionship. So there are things like this. Therese is one of the experts in Melbourne on this. Accompaniment for us could mean things like taking a trafficked person to get her enrolled in a course, a simple course. We've got to negotiate systems, particularly TAFE systems or university. They're very difficult systems if you don't have the language. Support for things like parent-teacher meetings, going with them and helping to talk through situations about their child. Attendance, one of the good things is attendance at meetings with people. Maybe it's just at a parent-teacher, maybe it's in a graduation ceremony, maybe it's a ceremony that a person's become an Australian citizen. So we've had there's some joys in some of this, especially when we get to know these women well. Being present at life milestones. Just recently, one of the women who has now a visa, but we've been accompanying for a long time, and Therese being one of the main accompaniers, had twins. And so there's been a huge outpour of support for this new mum, and as a family they're finding their way in Australia. So it's those things are great when those things happen. So accompaniment, and it might mean access to medical services. Often it's been negotiating with hospitals, say Cabrini, St Vincent Health, Mercy, the Mater in Brisbane, paying for dental care. If a person's been addicted and is coming out of addiction, there's often been a lot of dental repair work needed if a person is needing that kind of care. Transport, we got a little grant that helped us to get a car for somebody so that she could get herself to study. You know, from a very... and then family connections. Why we say there are children, we've actually, when some people have been given visas to stay in Australia, they've then brought their children, and we've supported and assisted them bringing their children into the country to have the family reunited. Accommodation, I left it in red because it's driving us crazy. We can't, like everybody, we know in Australia and particularly Melbourne and Sydney, the rental market is appalling. It's so difficult for anybody to get into it, and for us trying to find places for women who've been trafficked and you're looking for a safe and a secure place, it's very difficult, and we're finding that most challenging. One of our partners that we work with is the Salvation Army, and they have a safe house in Sydney, and it accommodates 8 to 10 people. So but it's the only place in Australia. So then we're looking, when we're trying to work with some other agencies, can we find more accommodation. One of the other areas in working for the trafficked person is trying to get some compensation. These people have had a crime, no matter what form of trafficking, they've had a crime committed against them in Australia. So they're entitled to crimes compensation. Most of them don't get it, but we've had some test cases, and these 3 pro bono lawyers, great women who've come to the fore to help us, have taken first of all 4 test cases and more recently another test case. So we've had 5 successful cases of compensation for this crime of trafficking being committed against you in this country. The third area that we work on is trying to get change, collaborate for change, advocacy around change. And these are the areas that we've been working on and still need a lot of work. Forced labour, forced marriage, looking at slavery-free supply chains. That is important because it's the preventative arm of human trafficking. The protocol has prevention as well as protection of the people and prosecution. And the prevention arm is ensuring that somewhere along the line where you know that you can have some influence, that you can prevent some people being somewhere along the line in human trafficking. The prevention through the provision of overseas development aid, which is also it's a prevention strategy. We're very disappointed that our advocacy with the government hasn't been successful or putting emphasis, because overseas development aid now is down to a very small percentage, less than 1%, I think, less than 0.2. And we're saying it should be 0.7 across developed countries. And we've gone backwards in the last 4 or 5 years. And then we're looking and advocating to have an independent anti-trafficking commissioner and a new act. And so we're trying to work legislatively as well, because this is a way of addressing human trafficking. How are we going? Okay, so I'll be quick. So forced labour, building sites, agricultural, boxing rings, we've had them in abattoirs, in convenience stores, think of 7-Eleven, thing that's been domestic work, even in diplomatic households, private homes, massage parlours and brothels. The common story for all of these is that there's really high hopes of working for an Australian wage, and not that you would be trapped in severe exploitation. Some have their passports taken, some are tricked into visa fraud, some are intimidated, some receive no wages or little, and some are grossly underpaid. How can we address this? We're advocating to get some sanctions that don't really exist too strongly on the Migration Act, employer sanctions, for the licensing of labour hire companies, to stop as soon as you get a group of they do a raid, the federal police do a raid somewhere. Our group over in ACRATH was working, and there were a group in Carabooda out doing farm work. They were picked up, they were brought into Perth, and they were deported. Nobody questioned what's happened to them. They should not have been summarily deported without some investigation of what happened, how they got here, and what happened to them while they were here. And then we're setting up mechanisms to link overseas workers into Australian society. So in a few areas where it's very vulnerable, say up around Bundaberg, Gladstone, our groups have been working there to get the Catholic community and the Uniting Church communities together to say, if there are big groups of overseas workers, some of them may have a visa to work and may be paid well, but we're discovering that most don't. And if they can have a friendly connecting point in the area to know their rights and to be supported to speak about their situation, that's part of the work of addressing it. Forced marriage, thank you. We have trialled a program to teach young people that this is, they have rights to say that it's my life and my rights not to be married as a child. A new law was introduced in 2013 in Australia, and it's part of the trafficking tranche of legislation. And we are doing some education around that, particularly in vulnerable populations where there's quite a mixed community, government schools, Catholic schools, and in some instances they could be Muslim families, in some of them they could be Orthodox Christian. So, but it's cultural, and it's helping to understand the cultural problem, that whether it's cultural or not, in Australia it's against the law, okay? And this sort of program is really important. That's just a summary of what, but I'll give you an example of why it's important. 2 Saturdays ago, we were asked, there was a child had been taken by her family to marry a 42-year-old in another country. A friend of hers had heard about the program, the My Rights, and we're talking about kids, contacted the embassy in the country where the child had been taken. They contacted the AFP. The child was brought back to Victoria, not to the state where she had been trafficked from, so that between all of us, we would be able to work out a way of protection for that child, work with the family. Will the child be safe going back to that family or to her family? She'd love to be with her family, but she doesn't want to be married to a 42-year-old at 15. Right? So it's those kinds of things. The other area that I spoke about was the whole thing of slavery-free supply chains. We're trying to get young people, school children and parishes, community groups to take action, to put emphasis and to take action to address the huge trafficking that there is in supply chains. And we've targeted chocolate because it's really small children who are doing the picking because of the size of the plants. They're young children who should be in school, and many of them are in West Africa, and they're being trafficked across borders and across the Gulf there in West Africa to into cocoa picking. Cotton is a bit similar. They just bring them out of school and they're in indentured labour. And it has a flow-on effect. So when you think about it, there can be slavery, there can be trafficking at the beginning of the supply chain, in the production and the preparation, then in the making of garments, and then in the transport. So you can see it's a whole thing. We need to be more aware as citizens of where do our goods come from, And so we've been doing things about putting pressure on companies, campaigns about, and we've had some success. Look for these certification certificates on your products, both food and clothing. You'll see these symbols, and they show that they've been through a certification process. And there is a fair bit of, I suppose, belief that it is helping at the other tier end. Down the back, there are some leaflets. One is on the Ethical Fashion Guide, and the Baptist World Aid have checked through many fashion companies. They're listed, it's only tiny print, so there's many of them, and they're looking at where is their trafficking in their supply chain and how are they judged. And the other area that we're concerned about is coltan. Coltan is the product that's in every computer and every mobile phone. So it's being mined at a huge rate. Children are, in the main, the people who are being brought into the mines where they can't keep up with the supply, and children are in these mines because it's a little bit, it's quite shallow mining, so it's not like big gelignite and stuff, but it's kids getting into crevices. So we're looking at trying to look at that. And then some global networking. There's a thing called the Trafficking in Persons Report, which came out yesterday, and we make a submission to it because it's one of the things you can then talk with the government about in your advocacy and saying, you know, we need to pick up the game on this area of human trafficking. We work with our local partners. We go to Canberra and try to push 3 or 4 things we want some change on, because we really believe that systemic change is key to getting improvement and reduction of human trafficking. And our 4th thing is we're trying to build our financial sustainability. We actually have a small grant from the federal government, which finishes this week. And then many religious congregations have given us donations. But we have enough where, and we employ someone, our wages is about 0.9 of a salary. And we have 90 volunteer sisters and brothers, and a few of our friends, about 60 nuns and brothers, and about 30 lay folk who have joined in with us in all around the country with our groups. So what can you do? Learn a lot more. We need to learn more. If you would like our newsletter, Therese has a clipboard, and she'll pass it around while I take any questions. Talk to 3 people, look at something and talk to 3 people during this week, because the more awareness there is, the more pressure there is, we can bring about change, and even alerting yourself. Okay? And any of those campaigns that are on the, chocolate, if you're going to buy Easter eggs next year for your children, grandchildren, just go and check the certification, because it's a way of teaching the next generation not to be unethical consumers, because they're actually, and I'm as guilty of as anyone else, we are contributing to the chain of human trafficking if we don't address it.